So welcome to the first of these service design methods videos. If you've been following along, you will have seen that we've done a range of stakeholder mapping activity that will speak to both the service design activity, but also the communication planning and a range of other purposes around the project planning. But this user profiles introduction builds on that work, but is very much now moving forward with the service design specific part of the project. But it does so with a view to supporting you to plan and undertake the neighbourhood analysis that we have to undertake as part of Work Package 4 on the Eye-to-Eye project. So we've begun, hopefully, all of us, by thinking quite broadly about all the different stakeholders that are part of this process. And now we're really interested in having prioritized them or thought about who those key individuals might be, to develop a slightly deeper and richer understanding of who those people are, so that we can begin to think about how we might approach them in the next service design methods and as part of the neighbourhood analysis to begin observing them and interviewing them. Successful observation or successful interview requires that we understand a little about who it is that we're interviewing and who it is that we're observing. And really the main point here also is about our own learning. What were our assumptions at the start of this process? Who did we think was at risk of social isolation and loneliness? What neighbourhood did we choose to go out and explore that concept further in? Why did we think that that was the right thing to do? And was that assumption accurate? We won't know until we've done it, but we also won't know unless we begin to sort of document some of those assumptions beforehand. And as I say, some of those assumptions beforehand will also help us as we plan the observation and the interview process. So what is a user profile then? A user profile comes, I think, mostly from service design's background in the private sector, where a lot of the service development activity would be driven by commercial imperative, and where also there would be an emphasis put on marketing data, so identifying who your customer segments are, who you deliver your service to, and refining your proposition, going out interviewing users to improve the quality of your products or your services. So it's perhaps something that's a little unusual to do in the sort of social policy context, because at least at this point in the process, we're not trying to sell anything. And indeed, the process of sort of compiling these very data-driven profiles of who people are is also a little uncomfortable, I think. We sort of run the risk of being seen to be problematizing or stigmatizing particular groups with the best intentions, but nonetheless, by singling out certain people over a certain age or a certain sexuality as particularly at risk of social isolation and loneliness may be true, but it's something that we need to approach quite sensitively. I think the other reason we're conducting these user profiles and articulating them at this stage in the process is also helpful is for those of us who have been taking a particularly data-driven approach. There's definitely a number of us on this project who've been looking at our public health data and other statistics that we have available at a national level or at a local level, identifying who are the people who said in the last census or in the last public health survey that they feel lonely. This is a known social problem, and a lot of us have been gathering data on that for some time in our organizations. So in a sense, and increasingly I think as time goes on and we become more data oriented in how we work, uh, being able to humanize that data and being able to have a concrete representation of, at a general level, who the people are that that data represents is absolutely vital for us to be able to discuss it in our project teams. And for us to be able to document what are some of the assumptions that we've made about who these people are. And so that we can have some degree of accountability and transparency around that. This isn't just stuff that's stored in the heads of the individuals. And this is particularly true when we go out and we conduct interviews or the observation that we've taken the time before we do that to begin to think about, well, who are the people that we're looking for when we go out? Who are the people that it's important for us to interview? And what are our assumptions or our even biases? What are the stereotype notions that we have around who these people are? How will we even know what they look like on the street to be able to approach them? How can we pick up on subtle social cues and nuance that people are expressing to be able to go, aha, okay, I know what they're alluding to, because we've spent some time beforehand understanding the context and understanding the users that we're focusing on. So user profiles are very much the first step towards that. And this is something that we can definitely talk more about as this project develops. We're doing a lot of work in Värmland just now around using user profiles like these that we'll discuss in this video to also reflect on our own biases and our own norms as the public sector workers going out and conducting this work. How representative of these target groups are we as the individuals ourselves who are conducting this work? And how much are we in danger of skewing our own perception or the our organization's perception of these issues by being slightly blind to our own norms and the norms that shape our own worldview and our own perception of who the people are that are at risk of social isolation and loneliness. So this is definitely an area where user profiles can help us. And this is definitely something that I think will be very exciting for us to share with each other as we work together on the Eye to Eye project, looking at how we can document and reflect upon our evolving understanding of who our users are and who the people are who are at risk of social isolation and loneliness as the project develops. And seeing the user profile as a valuable tool at this starting point in the process, but also something that we can continually revisit and update as the project progresses and as we gather more and more representative and rich qualitative data by going out and talking to people. So for those of you who've been following along with these videos or conducting the work that's expected of us so far in the Eye to Eye project, I think we'll all already have maybe at a lesser or greater level an idea of who our users are or who the users are that we're going to approach in the first instance. Maybe where our neighbourhood is, maybe some assumptions about who the users are that we'll meet in that neighbourhood, because that was, I guess, the reason why we've maybe chosen to focus on it. An area of particular social deprivation as one of the factors that can lead to social isolation and loneliness, an area with more elderly people than another, which is maybe why we chose to focus on it. Or maybe there are those of us who've taken a more general view, that we've literally just picked an area because it is the local area that we serve. But then we need to be able to spot and identify the people who are particularly at risk as part of the deliverables we have on Eye to Eye about identifying risk profiles around users and building this picture of how service providers in our area meet and can understand the risk of social isolation and loneliness. But at a very simple level then, we have a list of who these users are, whether through the formal stakeholder mapping processes or just kind of implicitly in our own mind as we've started this work. And from what I can understand, or my own interpretation, or our own interpretation here in Värmland of the criteria for this project, there are no real right or wrong answers around that. We've shared a lot of research with each other. The model that I've used throughout these videos and that showed at the start of this presentation is one example of how we can begin to problematize, or how we can begin to understand what the existing research already tells us about who the people are who we may wish to focus on. And we've also talked earlier in the project about how we draw a boundary around our investigation. So is that defining that geographically, spatially? As I say, just literally picking a neighborhood, a physical neighborhood, and saying anybody, any person who is in here is within our area of interest? Or is it actually identifying a particular community of practice that we already know are at risk of social isolation and loneliness, and looking a little bit deeper in that particular community? Is that what we mean by a neighborhood? Or is it people who've self-identified? And this is, I think, particularly true of loneliness as opposed to social isolation. Certainly the definition that we've centered upon ourselves here quite a lot is that lonely is a self-expressed concept. So I think there's some issues to navigate there around how we set the boundary around who our users are in this investigation, and then in turn who the users are that we'll be meeting when we go out and start to observe or conduct interviews in this context. But however you've shortlisted this group, or however you've chosen a physical boundary around this problem, and in terms of, in particular, if not the project as a whole, but planning the particular neighbourhood analysis aspect of this work, it's the first step in developing user profiles is really just to elaborate as a group, ideally, but even as an individual at your desk, who those people are. The last time you were in that neighbourhood, what sort of people did you see? And following this process of listing or shortlisting the different users that you assume you will meet in this neighbourhood or this context that you're going out and looking at, it should thereafter be possible to prioritize or categorize those users as they are relevant to the neighbourhood analysis. Of this long list that either came from your stakeholder mapping more generally, or that as you've sat and thought about this problem right now, who are the ones that are of primary interest? And there's no real right or wrong way to think about this. Perhaps how you've approached your work already, or how you and your project team are thinking about this project, is already beginning to shape that understanding. The particular research questions you're interested in, or the particular things that the statistical data you've already looked at has thrown up, maybe gives you a sense of which users are more important than others to at least begin the conversation with. So there's no real right or wrong answer to this, and it's very, very hard as far as this general introduction to service design goes for me to provide too much structure right now. But this is definitely something that we can discuss in the webinar and throughout the project. If there are some of you who are sitting there struggling with this distinction, how do we prioritize different types of users over another? If you haven't done it already and you are struggling with this, I would recommend you go back to the stakeholder mapping videos and some of the activities that I've already introduced in this series to help you begin to think about that, because it could simply be the ease of access that you have to these users that help you determine who are the primary users and who are the secondary users. It could be that you have a particular interest in focusing on service delivery professionals rather than the end users, the service users themselves. And from what I can understand of the project, that would be absolutely fine, but it's at this point that you need to begin to make that explicit. And at least in the first instance of this project, just as some way of helping you ground and make more concrete your aims and ambitions for this neighbourhood analysis, so that then as we go through these videos and over the next month or so, we can begin to make explicit plans for how we're actually going to go out, literally or digitally, and meet with these individuals and ask them appropriate questions. So as I say, the primary users will be the main individuals that you're interested in talking to in the first part of this project. Are they elderly people? Are they other people who the research has told us are at increased statistical risk of loneliness and isolation? Are they service delivery professionals who may have more direct contact and their own experience, professional or personal, of dealing with this particular social problem? It's really up to you how you wish to define that, or who you think you're most likely to meet in your neighbourhood. And then you have secondary users, who are the ones that maybe aren't in the neighbourhood the whole time, but play a significant role. They could be managers of particular services, or they could be relatives of particular service users. So again, using visual tools perhaps like the bullseye that we introduced in the stakeholder mapping video, and that's available to download alongside these videos, can be a very useful way of just thinking like layers of an onion. Who are your primary users in the center, in this human-centered approach to thinking about social isolation and loneliness? And then who are the next layer out from them? The people who have a significant influence on the context or on the neighbourhood, but maybe aren't there the whole time. Maybe you won't be guaranteed to meet them when you go there, but that you still maybe want to think about bumping into or having a conversation with as you conduct this work. And then there's a final group, which, when we think about the quadruple helix more broadly, can be a very valuable group, but again, maybe don't inhabit that particular neighbourhood or the particular context that we're looking at all, but their role here can still be significant. Perhaps they're researchers who've helped inform your judgments at this stage, or perhaps they're politicians who have overall responsibility for this neighbourhood or this particular social policy area, but you wouldn't see in the context, but that are still worth thinking about. And these tertiary users can be very powerful. The example from private sector service design is that your tertiary users can be, in fact, people who aren't even your users at all. They could be people who use competitors' products. They could be people who work for other organizations. But they can still have very, very valuable perspectives, almost more valuable sometimes than the people who are at the coalface, who are your primary users, because they can bring that external perspective, or they can have a whole different perception of the neighbourhood or the context that you're looking at. So again, very worthwhile thinking about who those people are, and then beginning, as we will later on, to think about how you might still involve them in the process. So there's just one final thing to think about with respect to this sort of categorization of users, and that's to keep an eye out for users who have multiple roles. People whose position in the neighbourhood maybe changes, or position in their context changes. They could be a manager, but they perform frontline service work. They could be a professional, but that they're perhaps a service user themselves. And it really depends on where you're drawing your boundary. But I think this concept, particularly in Corona time, is very, very interesting. We all of us, I think, in every society in the world, but particularly every developed society in the world, have had a new and personal insight to social isolation relative to, say, when the project, this project started. And I think it will be very difficult for us to go out and ask people about social isolation and loneliness without some reference to Corona situation. So this idea of the multiple roles we can play, asking people to think about what this concept means to them on a personal level, or in terms of how they look after their parents or keep an eye on their parents, as well as asking them the questions when you come to interview them or when you come to observe them, to be able to ask them about their professional responsibilities or their more day-to-day habitual responsibilities. So sort of being aware that we're adopting these very simplified notions of who users are, but to keep aware that that can change. It's a dynamic concept, and that people can perform different roles. The same people can perform different roles in the neighbourhood. So I've alluded to this already, but the main stage now in this process, having identified and prioritized different users in your proposed neighbourhood or your proposed context, or if you haven't even got to that point yet, the list of users that you now have should be helping you identify which neighbourhood might be of most relevance, but is really just to document some of the assumptions. Who are these people? What do we think about them? Why do we think that they are relevant? And this can come in whatever form you see fit. It could be a verbal discussion that you have as a project group with somebody taking notes, or you taking notes yourself. It could be self-reflections. It could be a written summary, the like of which may form part of the eye-to-eye report that we're all supposed to be beginning our work on. But really just elaborating, perhaps also with reference to some of the research that has informed these assumptions. Really just elaborating why it is that, say, hypothetically, we've chosen to identify people over 75, and in that particular part of town, people over 75, what other data do we have, or what else do we know about them, or what other qualitative insights from previous projects do we have that can help paint a picture of who those people are? And really just beginning to develop a list of characteristics of those people. And again, this can be informed by statistical data that we may have at our disposal within our organization, or it can be very much based on your own assumptions as a project group. And I would encourage you to be quite brave here, because very much one of the principles that we promote when we talk about service design is that we embrace an experimental culture. That these assumptions now about our users do not need to be correct. They do not need to be right. We do not need to be worried about getting it wrong. As long as we have that understanding within our project group, and as long as we're very careful about how we express and share that information, very much the work that we're planning to conduct when we go out and we do interviews and we do observation is to understand more, to correct some of our mistaken assumptions about different users. Perhaps part of the reason that people end up socially isolated, or perhaps out of the reach of public services, which is to say excluded, or perhaps the reason people feel lonely and misunderstood is because we have made some mistakes as public sector providers or as voluntary sector organizations. We're not saying the right things. We do not have the right picture in mind of who we're talking to when we talk to people. So very much the hope, I think, in this work is that by being able to be honest about some of our assumptions and to treat this process as an experiment to test our assumptions and to be prepared to be wrong about people and to learn more about people and to be curious, to broaden our understanding, is very much what this user profile sets the foundation for. There are a number of templates that we can provide, but really it's not about following the template. The important part is doing the thinking. And obviously having some way of documenting that thinking is important too. But really whatever form you feel is most appropriate, given the users that you're reflecting upon, And given the nature of the inquiry that you're following, we can certainly discuss this as a group if people are sort of struggling. Okay, I get what you mean, Fergus, but how do I write this down? We can talk more about that. But really, it is in whatever form you feel most comfortable. A few paragraphs in a Word document, some post-it notes as part of a group discussion, some notes in a notebook. It's really very much up to you. The important thing is that you start to think about these things. In terms of what categories or what categorizations are most useful at this stage, we're still looking for things that have a qualitative dimension, of course, but that are reasonably abstract, reasonably sort of statistical in terms of who these people are. We're not talking about specific individuals. We obviously can, if we have those images in our mind, we can use those to inform our assumptions or to help us describe our assumptions. But we're not looking for rich qualitative insights at this stage. We're simply looking for generalizable patterns about who different types of people are, so that when we go out in the streets or when we go out and do a neighbourhood analysis, we can make distinctions between different groups. So the sort of characteristics that, for example, we could use to describe people are their age range, their gender, where they live, socioeconomic status, occupation, and things like education level. But really thinking back to the marketing origins of this concept of user profiles, thinking about how can we describe the different users that we're interested in meeting in this work in generalized ways, generalized but distinct ways, and how can we summarize them. But at this point, as you've been completing this process, you should have a short list of key users, secondary users, and tertiary users that you are expecting to meet in this context, or that within your region as a whole you are aware are at heightened risk of social isolation and loneliness. And you should also, with that, have a slightly elaborated view of how you see those people already, what information already exists, what knowledge you already have organizationally or individually or in your project team. And this maybe to some of you is still slightly unclear as to why we would be gathering this data. So if it's helpful to sort of think about, it's really at a simple level how you're going to be able to strike up a conversation with those people. Thinking about what is it that you might have in common with those people? What is it about your assumptions about who those people are that could lead to some sort of common ground? Or you being able to frame the discussion around social isolation and loneliness, or the observation of these people in their neighbourhood, you being able to tune in to their circumstance, tune into who they are as people. Begin to prepare yourself as fully as possible with what it would be to be that person, to think empathically with the challenges they face, so that when we go out and we meet these people, we can begin to have a meaningful interaction with them. So it's worth also making the point here that a lot of the knowledge that we're sharing with you here, certainly from Värmland and how we practice service design, tends to have quite a strong organizational focus. We are interested in how we can better deliver services within our organization, and a lot of these tools themselves are used that way by us, but also come from the service design professional background of thinking about how organizations, both public and private, can deliver services. So some of the next areas of categorization that can be useful to think about as you're constructing these user profiles, or as you're summarizing the different users in your context, may not be entirely relevant depending on your particular focus. But I'm going to share them here in the hope that they might be, or at least it helps you understand both how you might use this service design approach in future in other projects or later in this particular project. But I just add the caveat that for some of you, I'm aware this is a neighbourhood analysis in terms of going out into a local context where it's not so explicitly focused on people who are providing the service. They might be your secondary or tertiary users. But for others of you, and given the organisations most of us work in, I suspect there will be a strong element, particularly around the work package 5 deliverable, around producing tools to help frontline practitioners better identify or better work with people who are at risk of social isolation and loneliness, or to help provide frontline practitioners with new tools in this area. Understanding what activities users who are frontline service providers currently undertake, and beginning to think about what our assumptions are about that at this stage can be very, very helpful if we're then going to go out and interview them shortly in this project. To begin to think what it is we already know or think we know about how it is to be a frontline service provider in this area. And this more generally can also be what our assumptions are about that user's understanding of that service area, what their knowledge is about that neighbourhood. This one might be one of the starting points for our conversation when we begin to think about our interview questions a little later, is how do we open up a conversation with these users, but based on some assumption or some guesswork on our part about what their existing knowledge might be. What questions are best to ask them to open up that knowledge and to build a platform to then ask deeper questions about their lives and their work. And what are their attitudes or values? This is probably one of the areas that will be hardest to guess. We'll have to go and ask them. But are there any generalizable opinions that we have about what people like them would think about this? And how can we frame our own guesswork about that, our own assumptions about what people like them would think? How can we use those assumptions to help us come up with some questions that challenge us, that help us see a fuller picture? And these last two characteristics, again, perhaps more focused for service providers already. These are very important questions when you're developing digital technology or when you're communication planning. But what are our assumptions about the best way to reach certain users? Are there any generalizable ways that they'll access information or consume information? Are they more likely, if they work in a practical profession, to be a hands-on learner, to be a visual learner? If they're academics, are they likely to be more cerebral? Are they likely to be happier to read longer form bits of information? What are these kind of assumptions that we can begin to document as we start to build these profiles of the different users we're planning to meet? And how can we think about, and a little linked to some of the stakeholder mapping and communication planning that we have already done in these videos, but what are our assumptions about the best way to communicate with these people? So now that we have this wide range of different characteristics that we've begun to visualize and think about in relation to the different users that we think will exist within the neighbourhood that we're planning to go out and investigate, or the different types of users we're most interested in identifying in the neighbourhood, we can start to think about what are the generalizable tendencies. Will all those users have those same characteristics, or will there be some variation? What will be the cause of that variation? Will we need to approach people who are new in the neighbourhood slightly different to people who've lived there their whole lives? Will our questions that we ask them, or the things that we're planning to observe, have to take account of the fact that these different qualities that we can identify in our potential users might vary. And then finally, to support our planning and thinking about how we will begin to approach these users, can we group the different users with their different characteristics that we've just identified? Can we group them by similarity, by physical location, by attitude, maybe to help us plan how we will approach them in the neighbourhood, or to identify which time of day or night it's better to contact them? Will certain types of users be more likely to be in the same place at the same time based on some of these characteristics? Will some of them be more likely to access certain types of information than others based on these characteristics? So really just to begin thinking about, as I said all along, our current assumptions about who these people are in this neighbourhood, or if you're using this approach in another context, in the workplace environment you're investigating, or the public service or private sector service delivery context in which you're operating. Beginning to build these statistically informed, but now qualitatively kind of elaborated pictures of who the users are. And building on this, in the next few videos, we're going to start to think more concretely about how then we will approach those users and how we will plan the observation and interview activities to go out and test some of these assumptions.